So I'm here to introduce Max Gladstone. When Max came to audition for the writers group that we are now both a part of, my hopes were not particularly high. We'd had a couple of folks try out, and their writing was mediocre, and more importantly, their critiquing style was very soft and very bland. Oh, I liked this story a lot. It's really nice. The unofficial motto of our writers group is that we're cruel because we care. And Max fit right in. He was a magnificent contrast to the previous people that we'd had. His story was nothing like anything we'd read before. There was no trite retelling of the Wheel of Time. There were no Isaac Asimov knockoffs. And his crits were brutal in the best possible way. He would tell you that your magic system was not coherent. It didn't make sense. But without going into the Brandon Sandenberg? Yes, there we go. Brandon Sanderson level of, and the magic system is the whole story. This weekend, he critted one of my stories, and I ended it, and I put, holy crap, I didn't realize I had that many problems. Oh, this is awesome. It's like having a readability reviewer for your prose. Max has readability. He crits our work without a linter, for style, for content, for repetition, and ultimately for originality. Max takes his stories and he'll find two completely disparate things like economics and blood magic and shove them together. And the net result is that we end up with something like the craft verse, where we all really enjoy what we're reading because we've never read it before, but it has all of the bits and pieces that we're already familiar with. So we don't sit there and go, I am confused. And instead you go, what's gonna happen next? And so on that note, my friend, and also an excellent author, Max Gladstone.
Thanks so much. When Anne started talking about the first meeting that I was at Brawl, I suddenly remembered, because I'd never had any experience with doing a critique style, doing a fiction critique in the way that it's typically done in the science fiction and fantasy circles before. I had done a couple of fiction classes in college, I wrote a lot on my own, and I'd bashed around a bunch of fan fiction with friends. So when I sat down to read the stories, I got out the red pen and was going line by line with the crosses and the circles and the arrows and the this is that and is that. And it's amazing that you guys didn't just set me on fire after the end of that meeting, but it was enormously helpful also. I thought I might read a little bit from the beginning of Ruin of Angels, which is the 6th book in the Craft Sequence series, which my agent continues to groan whenever I describe it that way. I tell them they're different things. They're different things. A series is the sum of a sequence. And then he told me that the next time he sends out a book of mine on submission, he's going to just replace the bio with Max writes some stuff. So, fair deal. Power relationships and everything, I guess. So I'm going to read the first chapter and then a bit of the second chapter that I imagine you guys might get a kick out of, and talk a little bit about the books, about where the ideas are coming from and where they're going, open it up for questions, and hopefully we can have a nice chat. Chapter 1. Lei built her sandcastle below the tide line. Kai warned her, of course. What else was an older sister for? When Lei chose her spot and planted her flag, Kai said, "It will drown." That last word tugged at her, as if it left a hook in her lip. She almost apologized, but stopped herself. Drown was the right word. You couldn't avoid words just because they hurt. When Lei sculpted the gap-toothed ramparts of her keep like castles from the kind of Schwarzwald fairy tale picture books where kids got eaten, Kai said, "You see, that's the tide line up there where the seaweed's drying?" When Lei carved a curtain wall with a bright blue trowel, packing wet sand between her palms, Kai said, "Your wall's too thin to keep the water out." "It's not to keep the water out," Lei said. "It's to keep out our enemies." "You don't have enemies." Lei shrugged and dug her moat. Mom wasn't there to help. Today was a mourning day. She'd gone with her sisters to Kai's father's grave to paint her face with ashes and sit naked alone until the tears came. She had grieved with her children, noble and sharp in mourning white, the day the bearers brought her husband home. She stood chin out, brow high, eyes bright and black, impassive as a penitent on the outside. Each body holds multitudes, the old songs sang. As a mother, she helped her children mourn their shipwrecked father. As a wife, as a woman, as someone who'd lost a friend, she needed time alone to break. She left Kai in charge because Kai was older and because Kai didn't set things on fire just to see what color they burned. But Lei only had the vaguest grasp of the meaning of the phrase "in charge," and Kai knew better than to test her younger sister on this point. She still had bruises from the last time she tried. So Kai left Lei to work and climbed the beach to build her own castle, clear of the coming waves. The sand was drier here and didn't pack as well, so she brought a halved coconut shell to the surf, filled it with water, and carried it up the beach to moisten the sand. She built a spreading bay city like Cavacana, with a mountain behind it like Cavacana Eye, and studded the shoreline with pebble statue penitents watching seaward for the return of long-gone gods, heroes, fathers. Each time she went back to the ocean, her sister's city had grown. Lei excavated alleys with her fingertips and cut decorations on rooftops with a sliver of bamboo. From above, her city looked intricate as a craftwork diagram or a work of high theology. Lei, kneeling, brooded in her swimsuit, brows low as if to cut off the half of the world that didn't concern her, the beach, the volcano rising inland, her sister. She bit her lower lip as she worked. "You have to do something," Kai said. She chose her words carefully. That was the joy of words. You could control them when all else failed, or the whole thing will fall down. Up the beach, bigger kids shouted and screamed. A pale-skinned Askari tourist girl dove to return a volleyball serve and fountained sand where she fell. The sea lay calm to the horizon, but no one swam. The red flag was up today, gallo glass swarming beneath the water with their long, stinging tendrils, though they could not be seen from shore. White sails bellied on the bay. Cutters and dinghies and barks wheeled in defiance of the massive container ships moored near West Claw at the deepwater port. "You aren't listening." Lei didn't look up. Fine. Let Lei build her doomed city. Kai marched back up the beach, added houses to her island, and dug its bay deep for the tide rolling in to fill. Standing, she judged it good. Then she turned back. Lei's metropolis sprawled on shore. She'd worked out in a spiral from that central keep, spread townhouses and factories, extended her lanes as she came around to them again. Kai knew the world she had built from sand, but she knew Lei's world too, though she'd never seen it before. Those broad thoroughfares with divided roads and sidewalks were commercial streets, no processional boulevards down which ancient emperors once marched in triumph, bookended by arches. There were palaces, there high temples, here a factory. To the north, alleys grew so narrow Lei could not have made them with her fingers, must have dredged them with her bamboo strip. She had found a dream city inside them both and made it real. And the tide rolled in. Lei's hands didn't stop. The rest of her knelt rigid beside the district she shaped, while her thin fingers carved and built and stroked sand smooth. Kai grabbed her coconut shell, ran below Lei's city, and started to build a wall. She built artlessly because art was not the point. She did not know why Lei ignored her, why she made this weird familiar city. She did not know why Lei left glittering traces of her soul in the ramparts beneath her fingers, but she suspected. She could have asked Lei, taken her by the shoulders and shaken her and screamed until she stopped and tried to explain. But Lei's face reminded Kai of moms in mourning white, and the words she might say if Kai forced her to speak were words Kai knew she could not bear to hear. So she built the wall. With her hands, she built it, with her own surging shoulders and legs, with mom's thick fingers and dad's fierce grit. She gutted the sand with her coconut shell. The sun burned her eyes and warmed her skin and covered her with sweat. "Boy," a voice called to her in Askari from up the beach, the volleyball girl drunk in a white bathing suit. "Boy, you can't stop the tide." Kai ignored the girl, whose friends shushed her and tried to explain. Kai's wall was more of a hill, really, with a moat behind it deep as Kai was tall. She judged the wall's height against the tide line and started to curve up slope to guard the outer edges of Lei's city. She sweat and trembled. There wasn't time. She couldn't close the eastern wall before the tide rolled in. She knew this and did not let herself know, because if she knew, she would have stopped trying. An audience gathered up the beach, tourists and other monsters drawn by the two girls striving in the sand. A skeleton in a flower print shirt watched them rolling a newspaper into a tighter and tighter cylinder between his finger bones. Kai ignored them and kept fighting. The water rose as she built the wall. Every wash of surf bore more sand from the wall back out into the deep. Kai wasn't patting the sands down now, just digging it, tossing it up, and hoping. Behind her, a wave splashed into the moat. Wet sand stuck to Kai's feet. She sank. The wall cracked. Salt rivers poured in and soaked her to her waist. The north wall sloughed into the water. Kai scrambled to shore it up, but the next rushing wave tore her feet from under her. She went down in a tangle of limbs and foam. Waves and cross currents tossed her, tumbled her, and she spilled from the moat onto the beach. She spat out salt water and sand, and when she recovered, she looked back, expecting disaster. But Lei's city stood. The waves covered it and drained away through carved alleys that should have collapsed like Kai's wall. Lei stared down through the water and to the wash, and her city did not die. Lei's soul shimmered in the sand. She'd built herself into this city, mixing soul stuff into the sand with water, and now she stood above the world she'd made and willed it real against the waves. The sand held its shape. The city sank but stayed. It would not break while she had breath. Lei rose like a goddess over her creation as the tide rolled in. She stretched out her hands as if to calm the waves, and for a moment, Kai believed they might obey. Then Lei fell, screaming into the dirty water. She gasped, surf, gagged, choked, disappeared in the wash and foam. Kai ran into the water, caught her flailing sister around her shoulders, and dragged her to dry sand. Lei coughed up fluid, screamed again, though she had no breath. A white phosphorescent thread wound around her leg, menacing and tiny, a gallows glass tendril torn free and set drifting on the tide in search of a victim, probably not fatal. Kai gloved her hands in a gob of seaweed and pulled the tendril free. Snot ran from Lei's nose. Her eyes rolled white behind slitted lids. She breathed deep and fast. Venom leaked through Kai's makeshift glove and burned her palm. With the tendril gone, Lei stopped screaming but didn't open her eyes. Kai slung her sister's arm over her shoulder and pushed up with her legs. She took 3 steps and stumbled into water. Building the wall had exhausted her. She could not take Lei's weight. She ground her teeth and tried to will herself upright. She stood, too fast. Someone else held Lei's other side, the Askari girl in the white suit, the one who'd called her. Boy, she said again in Askari, what was she doing? Kai hadn't expected that question. She didn't think the Askari expected it either. She was scared of screams, that was all. She didn't know why Lei fell. Easy to see she'd never suffered a gallows glass sting before. A gallows glass would leave a bright red scar on that sharp, pale skin. The girl was embarrassed, like tourists sometimes felt when they helped or even noticed locals, and talking to cover her nerves. Playing, Kai replied in the girl's language, and didn't correct her about the other part. The girl helped her carry Lei up slope. The crowd drew back as they approached, clearing space on the boardwalk. They set Lei down carefully beside a discarded resort brochure. The skeleton watched them both from behind Ruby's spectacles, newspaper still clutched in his hand. He could have done something, Kai thought. A craftsman like that, all the power in the world at his beck and call. Lightnings danced when he crooked his finger. He could have stopped the pain at once. He adjusted his spectacles instead. A lifeguard shouldered through the crowd. The girl asked, why did she stay when the tide rolled in? Kai didn't answer. The lifeguard bent low, took a charm from his neck, and applied it to the sting. Blood seeped through torn skin, but at the charm's touch, Lei's flesh calmed, blood stilled. Lei stopped shaking and drew her first even breath. She wanted to save it, Kai said. Her voice hooked after save. Speaking Askari forced her to gender the pronoun, and she wasn't sure whether she chose right. She remembered Lei's expression, so like Mom's, unwavering and fierce as pallbearers approached their gate. She could have said, save him. Behind her, the sun set and the tide rolled up, the ocean at ease as if it had never killed a man. The parapets and pinnacles of Lei's city melted, its arches seeped out into the deep. Salt water filled Kai's model bay, and her tiny penitents stared out over the flat, poisoned sea. Save what? The girl asked. But Kai wasn't sure, and if she knew, she would not say. So chapter 2 starts about 20 years later, give or take a bit. Who would break into a bank to leave something? The practice is more common than one might think, though practitioners' motives tend to evolve, eventually removing more than they originally left. You might duck the bank's wards, dodge its constructs and revenants and demonic and even sometimes living human guards, evade its detection magics, dance across its pressure plate floor, answer ye its riddles 3, and leave a beacon glyph to guide tunnelers or a mechanism that would disable all that security during a later, more forceful raid. A simple listening device in the right place could yield the intelligence to corner or crash a market, or make a small, substantial killing, literal or metaphorical. But few people would break into a bank just to leave something, and fewer still would break in to leave a letter. So while the mailroom of Iscari First Imperial and Agdel Lex noticed that the vellum envelope that appeared in their priority delivery box one workday morning, sealed with blood-colored wax and the impression of a wolfsbane flower, lacked the customary sender's marks, the demon on duty believed this merely an administrative oversight. Mortals, honestly. If the letter had needed shipping to the Shining Empire, or west across the sea to Alt Coulum, or even north to Telemere, the demon would have wasted precious minutes hunting down the relevant admin so as to bill the postage properly. But an envelope for internal delivery needed no postage. Even so, the demon hissed and pondered taking bloody, demonstrative action. She'd warned the admin pool against using priority flags for internal mail. In-building post went round hourly, and while some market developments did need immediate response, once you let people flag intra-office mail, even inane check-ins mysteriously ended up marked triple urgent. A little bloodshed ought to help clarify the situation. The mail demon consulted the building register and found, odd, the recipient unlisted. Perhaps it was meant for outside delivery after all, but no address or postage. She closed her many eyes and replayed in her mind, as her therapist had suggested, a comforting series of human screams, starting with a 10 on the pain scale and counting down. That relaxed her enough for work. Then she checked the guest list and realized her mistake. Kai Pahala, whoever she was only visiting the office for a single day. The message's sender couldn't meet her in person and wanted to be sure the letter arrived before she left. Sensible. Saved postage, even. No one need die today. Though you never could tell when a bleak morning at the office might look up. Thank you. So the book had been out for a week when somebody sent me a message on Twitter saying, just so you know, I sent the mail demon portion to one of the guys who wrote Send Mail. And then I died a little bit of joy. So yes. The craft sequence is one of those threads in a sweater that you start pulling, and then the entire sweater starts to unravel after you. That's kind of how the sequence has built itself. Back in 2008, I'd recently returned from teaching in China and was looking for work when the basically world economy tripped and fell into a wood chipper. And as I was trying to piece what was going on together and spending a lot of time wandering around Harvard Law School, where my wife was a student at the time, and sneaking into student seminars that had been formed with exactly that question in mind, like what just happened? And as I started seeing more and more professors sort of drop out or fly off to Washington because, oh my God, the American financial system is in the middle of a collapse, we need to do something about this right now, I kind of got this sense that we were going through an enormous apocalyptic moment, but you couldn't exactly walk down to New York and find the smoking crater where Lehman Brothers used to be. You couldn't say, yes, here's the ruin of AIG laid in shatters and shards upon the mountainside, like the Balrog and Lord of the Rings. It was all happening on a kind of spiritual plane of existence, on a realm of contracts and ideas and images. And from there, I kept pulling, and the more I learned, the more I reached for my sort of arch-trad nerd Dungeons and Dragons vocabulary to start describing what was going on, and also the sort of religious work that I'd studied that I'd learned from my parents too. We have a vocabulary, a very long-standing vocabulary for dealing with enormous invisible forces that guard our destiny, and it's the vocabulary of magic and religion. And so much of what changes the material conditions of our lives these days transpires in a world that we can't touch or feel, but is nevertheless the same world. It's a world that sort of directly affects us, directly shapes us. It's not this sort of dualist separation that we sometimes talk about in philosophy, depending on our particular bent. So it started off with that, this notion that you have kind of bankruptcies that work a lot like necromancy, you have corporations and governments that work a lot like gods, you have people who work in, especially now that you have sort of a modern model corporation with like a mission statement or a set of collective ideals that everybody is attempting to strive for, at least in theory. It starts to resemble a priesthood, or it starts to think of itself as a priesthood, depending on who you're talking to. The sense of corporate mission or the sense of governmental mission. So, and then you have obviously the people who are the sort of people who are coming in to pray, the people who are coming in to use or to participate, or whose lives are formed by the decisions that are made inside the big cathedral building. So once I had those threads, Three Parts Dead, which is about basically a bankruptcy proceeding that's taking place on a dead god in a hope of sort of fixing him before his city starts to fall apart, took shape. But the more I pulled on that thread, the more connected it seems to the fabric of what it means to be aware and alive and operating in the early 21st century. And this is where I say things that start to get me a little bit in trouble. Like, you know, if you go back to look at 1950s and 60s classic golden age science fiction, people sort of anticipated that we would be living in a world that had many of the conveniences and many of the powers that our world now has. You know, we have regular flights up to resupply the International Space Station. There is, in fact, a kind of Heinlein-esque or self-styled Heinlein-esque individual who's building private space planes and things like that out in the Southwest. You know, a lot of people are definitely playing into that image set. But the old school science fiction also anticipates a world that is much more end-user knowable and serviceable than ours has ended up being. You have people have spacesuit will travel who are like building rocket ships in their backyard fundamentally, or, oh, I just got this spaceship kit out of an ad in the back of the newspaper, and I can sort of tool it all together, and now I'm going to go out to pressure test the spaceship, the spacesuit. And like, these are things that some people do, but there's things that some people do in our reality, but it's a more limited class of people that is doing them. And for a lot of folks, the incredibly complicated tools that they employ on a day-to-day basis to figure out how they're going to get to the Starbucks around the corner might as well be magic. You have something in your pocket that might as well be a magic mirror. In that you expect it to behave in a certain consistent way, you propitiate it in a certain fashion, you recognize that there is a system behind it that has complex interactions of which you only see this tiny little aspect, this sort of user interface. And some people know pieces of what's happening behind the glass, but very few, and I'd wager basically nobody knows everything that's happening behind the glass. The systems that we use have eclipsed, even at this reasonably sort of rudimentary level, if you're thinking about the sort of next potential 3,000 years of human technological development, if we're lucky and we get to do those, have already eclipsed our ability to comprehend as individual human actors. And so it starts to feel a lot more like magic, and I think this is part of the reason that fantasy has come to kind of own the airwaves and the movie sphere recently. You get science fiction movies which tend to be about very immediate problems. Something like Ex Machina, which is a movie about simulated humanity, artificial intelligence, some of the immediate threats or immediate moral and ethical quandaries that we're facing as a species. But the big blockbusters are basically fantasy blockbusters, not only the explicit ones like the Lord of the Rings series or the Harry Potter films, but also the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the kind of superhero universe, which is fundamentally a fantasy setting with a couple bits of science fiction that are glommed on. You have grand dramatic action in a world that is much harder for individual human beings to know and control. And that places certain challenges for the writing of fantasy and for the doing of technology also in everyday life, right? as a fantasy writer, that inspires me to keep going in and trying to make fantasy that actually looks and kind of feels the way that our world feels. Make stories that not only pull people into them, but are enlightening about how you relate to a world that is much bigger, older, more complicated than certainly you're told in grade school. The extent to which we're all setting out from Hobbiton as we begin our careers and are coming to understand that we're part of struggles that are much older and more complicated than any of us conceive at the outset. Or at least than many of us conceive at the outset, I don't know. And from the perspective of somebody who's out to build systems, the question is what sort of illusions are you presenting? What sort of surfaces are you presenting? What sort of rituals are you creating? And what are the consequences of those rituals? What does the system encourage people to do to one another and with one another? And I don't claim to have any answers to all of these. I just think that there are questions that we don't yet have any set answers for, and that are important, and that we need to kind of be living and thinking through. And I suggest, and this is kind of where I'm going with all of my books, that it is worth looking to older methods of interpreting unseen forces or vast forces to understand how people have historically related to things like destiny or the weather, to ask how people are, what are people's expectations and how do they relate to things like, I don't know, Wi-Fi or persistent connectivity. But that's just a kind of out there theory right now that I'm still working on. I'd love to have some questions from the audience right now, or else I can just continue babbling about all of these things for a while. Anyone have a thought?
Okay, so there's no number in the title. Ruin of Angels.
Oh, gosh.
And more generally, it took a long time before somebody pointed out to me that the first 5 are actually like numbered in chronological order, despite the order in which I read them. And, of course, reading them as they come out, there are, a bunch of obvious oddities, like, reading the story of an adult and then, getting to finally see the childhood where a lot of this came from in a later book in the series. But I would love to hear what you have to say about the order of the books and, the order that you think people will read them in now or in the future, and what the thinking was behind the chronology of the world.
Sure, thank you. For those of you who are coming more new to my work, I made a terrible, horrible, bad mistake when I started working on this that actually had, like a lot of my mistakes, had very good reasoning behind it. So I'll walk you through it. I loved and still love Terry Pratchett's novels. The Discworld books are, for my taste, one of the best examples that's out there of how to assemble a coherent, complicated, multifaceted world that we see from a lot of different angles and a lot of different points in time and points of view. But a frustration I always had as a kid, getting all of these books out of order, living in rural Tennessee and having a tiny local bookstore, was that I had no sense where Guards was with respect to the fifth elephant, or even though I could kind of tell one of them was coming after the other, how many books there were in between, or when characters were making an offhand reference to some adventure they'd had, whether I just missed a book or whether the book hadn't been localized into North American sort of publishing markets yet, or what. For a really long time, there's a book, Jingo, that was missing from the City Guards sequence in American publication, I guess because they thought that the word Jingo was too weird for an American audience, or I don't even know. But I had to track down, finally import it. Anyway, so really amazing books, but what order are you supposed to read them in? What order do things even happen in? Are you in fact getting the first book in the series when you think you're getting the first book in the series? So I thought, well, I admire that kind of random access approach to world building for a couple of different reasons. One, it gives you the feeling that I think we all have in our lives of coming into the middle of a story, even as we are embarking on our own personal story. You start off and you think you kind of know what the world is and how it fits together, but pretty quickly you learn that your initial conceptions maybe had some flaws in them. You need to build out your sense of how the world is and then revise your own path accordingly. So Three Parts Dead is a story that starts in a middle. Tara Abernathy is beginning her career as a craftswoman, and she has certain convictions about how the world fits together. Gods are old-fashioned, antiquated, and like, oh my God, why are we still, so to speak, why are we still doing any of this? I don't understand what all these religious people are getting out of it. Gosh, well, I guess I'll just chop up their deity, sew it back together, and move on with my life, or unlife, as the case may be. And that's where she's coming in. She understands the sort of initial, like, kind of high school historical viewpoint of what's happened in the last 150 years of her world, where the craft came from, what happened in the God Wars. She's very smart, she's very driven, she's very good at what she does, but she doesn't have that context yet. And Three Parts Dead is the story of her getting some of that context. But then we see the entire picture from another perspective in Two Serpents Rise, which is the next book. We see it from the perspective of a city that was colonized or conquered very early in the God Wars and has since developed as like a world of craftsfolk specifically, rather than Tara's perspective, which is a craftsperson who is an outsider to a religious community. And Drizzetti LX, which Tara again and again talks about as this like really awesome place, and she genuinely loves going to and really is excited about, has a whole bunch of issues that are more or less invisible to her, but become very visible when we see it from the perspective of people who grew up there and live there every day. But of course, they have a perspective on their own city's history that is warped by the narratives of its history that they've received. So when we see Drizzetti LX again in Last First Snow, about 20 years earlier in its run, we discover that some things which the characters thought were true aren't true. We discover that the narrative about a particular sort of riot and uprising that happened in the city's past is close, but not is close to the story that people are telling about it 20 years on, but isn't actually what people are telling about it 20 years on. So you get this multifaceted view of the history of the setting and of the meta plot, to the extent there is one in the craft sequence. You see it from this facet, and then this facet, and then this other facet over here, and you start to get a sense for the whole. This is a challenge in epic fantasy usually, because often, even if you're trying very hard in an epic fantasy, you get one basic through line. You get your main characters or your sort of party of adventurers who are going around, and they go to this one city, and this one city behaves in a certain way. And it's like, oh, this is the city of the super honorable people. When I was a kid, I loved reading David Eddings books, and David Eddings is the sort of arch king of this exact thing, right? This is the sneaky person country. Everywhere, everyone in this country is super sneaky all the time. We have a king, he's the sneaky king. We have thieves, they're extra sneaky thieves. We have knights who are honorable but sneaky about being honorable. Meanwhile, over here, exactly one country over, they share a border. It's the land of super honorable, like Southern French courtly romance people who are all living as if they are in a Southern French courtly romance all the goddamn time. So you go around the map. There's the poison people, and there's the like people who like trading a lot, and it's as bad as or as elementally considered as any Star Trek Planet of Hats. And there's a weird sort of this might be a strange word to use, but there's a weird sort of imperialism in thinking about worlds that way or in building worlds that way, because of course, if you want to privilege the perspective of our main character, Garion, in the David Eddings books, for example, as he's traveling around, it might entirely seem that this culture over here are the sneaky people, but he's only been there for 2 days, and most of those 2 days he was running from his life, for his life from some orc-type individuals or getting blasted with magic or something. He has no clue. He showed up and somebody picked his pocket, and his conclusion was, this is the sneaky country. So, not that places don't have their own authentic character, but it's very hard to get a sense of what that authentic character is when seen from outside. So I jumped around as I was writing the books in history and in geographic setting, and I thought, I'm going to make things really easy for people. it's obvious what order I wrote the books in, because it just says that in the copyright page, and you can see that on on Amazon. Your bookseller will tell you. It's easy to know what order they came out in. But what order do they happen in chronologically? I'll just put a number in the title of each one, saying what order they fall in the number line, and that'll allow me to leave a gap, and then I can put something into the gap later on, and this has confused people for 5 years. This is a classic case of over-design. Excellent feature, confuses the crap out of people, and I've been getting this same question or variations of it again and again. But I mean, not to throw you under the bus for asking the question. It's a good one. I get it a lot. I talk about this because it is important to learn from one's own mistakes. So of course I thought, brilliant idea. I've finished the first 5 books. I've tied them into a knot. This is, we've filled in all of the gaps in the number line. And now what I want to do, that I've shown this sort of world that's in the midst of a giant crunch, where people are desperately trying to figure out what happens next. Oh God, there are no good options. There seems to be no good options. The sad truth of reality is that entropy always marches forward. And even if there are no good options, you need to start taking action, or things are going to start happening around you, or both. So the rest of the books in the craft sequence, the idea is sort of time is going to be marching forward, and our characters are going to be dealing with a rapidly evolving and worsening situation. So every book after this is just going to be one after the other after the other. So I'm just going to take the numbers out of the title. Plus we have a different cover treatment. It's sort of like a season 2 of the series. It'll be really intuitive, and it's not been intuitive at all. So I don't know. I need quality testers or something. Well, okay. So the writing group are excellent quality testers for the actual fictions. And what I need is, I don't know, a business manager to come and whop me upside the head every once in a while, or I don't know. This is why I'm very happy with my new agent. Anyway, long, convoluted answer to a very simple question. But my apologies for everything. Yes?
So maybe this is another frequent questions. It's a little bit related, but I'm curious if sort of taking this sort of, not non-linear chronology and exploring the reasons for earlier things, if you ever get to a point where you regret a decision that you made in an earlier book and have sort of a temptation to retcon something, and if that happens, like how you deal with that.
Yes, and also no. Yes, there have been a couple world-building decisions that I made when I was writing 3 Parts Dead, like names for calling things, where it was a little too close to the name of something that was in a real-world culture. And some of those I caught and changed, and some of those I've been living with ever since, and that's fine. But in general, in terms of things that are not connected to nomenclature, right, like large-scale developments of cause and effect through the series, that hasn't happened so much. This is partly a virtue of containing the stories for each book to the book itself. So most of the cause and effect stuff that happens in a book is done by the time you turn the last page in it. So there are a few state changes in the world that need to carry over and I need to keep track of from book to book, but I don't need to keep track of a timeline of the internal chronology of each book in any subsequent book. It's also easy to explain any possible variance between people's stories from book to book as a variance of their knowledge of history or as somebody misremembering something. There's a sense of the timeline of the Skittersill Rising, which is the subject of Last First Snow, that isn't really reflected in Two Serpents Rise, which I wrote earlier. But the only sense of that timing that we get is from Caleb, who spends a decent chunk of the second half of Two Serpents Rise dying of extreme blood loss, and could reasonably be said to have a skewed perspective on the situation. So it's great. The other side of it is my own angle on world building is a little less encyclopedic than that of many epic fantasy people. Personally, I don't think there's actually a right or wrong way to go about it. There are just ways that you naturally go about it or not. There's the sort of Tolkien angle where you accumulate this enormous world-building document that is full of all your random ideas for things, and some of them connect and some of them don't. Some of them are going to be relevant to the book, some of them aren't. You're kind of building the bottom 90% of the iceberg so you know what goes on top. The way that I think of world building, especially in a large work like this, is kind of like a Go board. People familiar with the game of Go at all? I've used this analogy a couple of times before. I apologize if anyone has heard me make it. But you start off in Go with a 19 by 19 blank board. You're playing against another player. You're each laying down stones in sequence to try to basically wall off sections of the board with your color of stones or their color of stones. So you've got a white player and a black player. And the trick with the early stages of the game of Go is you're rarely playing stones that are right next to one another to build a very tight, connected wall. Because it's much faster to play stones that are all the way on the other side of the board from one another. You can build a very loose network that then you go back to fill in later. So in the course of writing any given book in the craft sequence, I'm laying a stone over here, and then I'll mention something that's happened 2 continents away, or an author that somebody likes, and that becomes a stone that's way over on the other side. So when I am eventually writing a book that's focusing in the upper right corner as opposed to the lower left corner that I've been focusing on in the previous volume, I'll know, okay, what do I know about this place? Well, yeah, somebody there really likes this particular author. They have very spicy food. They make rugs. So there's this particular myth that was echoed. There's a whale migration near there. And I have a lot of freedom within the minimal constraints that I've imposed on myself up to that point. So by keeping the framework very loose, it becomes an aid to creativity when I get to actually filling in that corner of the map. So no, on that level, I've never really regretted any major decisions that I've made outside of, again, the name of 1 or 2 people. But yeah, those decisions and even those offhand references end up becoming huge helps when it comes to writing a book out, and also offer me plenty of flexibility for investigating the corners of the map that I haven't really gone into yet.
So you mentioned at some point during your opening statement that you were interested in kind of how people operating in systems behave in reaction to those systems, or how systems might force them to react to each other,
right.
Or treat each other. So that must, that obviously implies that you've sort of built political systems or magical systems or economic systems or social systems. Where do you go for inspiration, or how do you develop those in the course of your writing?
Well, how do I develop the systems that I develop? A lot of research is what it comes down to. I'm rarely writing cultures or systems that are strict XPs, strict sort of fictional importations of other cultures, but I'm often thinking about a particular region or a particular sort of conflict that I can flesh out. I go to academic anthropology a lot for this sort of stuff, because anthropology tends to focus a lot more on the ways people respond to their environment and the ways people sort of socially code or socially react to their environment than on the specific evolving physical conditions. Kavakana, which is where the initial excerpt that I read from Ruin of Angels takes place and where Full Fathom 5 takes place, is set on a vaguely Polynesian island. And I was really interested in the question of cargo cults and the sort of development of local religions in the context of a much larger imperial system. So I read a lot about how those came to be and what role they were playing, and it turned out to be much more nuanced than I'd initially thought from your sort of reflexive sense. Oh, the cargo is dropped off, and then you worship the cargo. I started seeing it. And the anthropology texts were talking about it much more as a kind of revolutionary movement, or as something that's happening in response to a worldview that's encountering something that's basically out of its context. So you have a worldview in which the sea is kind of the border of the known. You can travel between islands, but there's always this sense that there's this enormous, vast expanse of water beyond all of the islands that you know. Maybe you can cross it, maybe you can't, but what's over there is fundamentally weird, and that's where the ancestors go when they die. And then all of a sudden, these people show up in ships from all the way across the world who talk about coming from a land that is across that unknowable gulf of water, and who seem fundamentally different from anyone that you've encountered before. And you can start talking about them as spirits in a way that recognizes that they are certainly not from wherever you are. They're not part of the deal that you're a part of with your landscape and your culture. And the initial, like, oh, it's sort of silly. The initial experience upon reading about a cargo cult, that like how weird they are talking about a rifle as a magical object, becomes a lot more sensible when you recognize that a colonial settlement doesn't have any of the tools. A European colonial settlement in like in Polynesia doesn't have any of the tools that they need to build a lot of the technological goods that they're importing. Right? You can say, oh yeah, we made this. Like, oh, the hell you did, right? Can you show me the factory that's going to make you a rifle? You guys are planting exactly the same crops we're planting. You have slightly weirder houses and you have stuffier dress, but you're fundamentally human. There is absolutely no way you made this thing. Obviously, what's happening is you are intercepting the shipments that our ancestors are sending to us and using them against us. So there's going to be some redress coming when that happens. You're getting this from a supernatural agent because obviously it's a supernatural agent. And that jump of conceiving of a foreign set of power relationships and a foreign set of technological material conditions in a truth system that you kind of grew up using, sort of ritualizing a different people's knowledge, is a process that I find really fascinating, and that's something that academic sociology gets into a lot. So I found James C. Scott seeing like a state enormously useful in sort of building the girders of this approach. There's a great book by Michael Taussig called The Devil and Commodity Fetishism in South America, which is about what happens when you take people who don't have a capital economy and you thrust them into the conditions of a capital economy. And one of the things that can happen anyway is that they conceive of the capital economy as witchcraft and as sort of corporate existence as a fundamentally satanic mode of being, which I think is pretty cool. Like, you start seeing when Colombia is colonized and when villages are forcibly shifted over into a plantation mode of agriculture. People are either enslaved or put into sort of exploitative agriculture company store kind of situations. You start seeing attempts to describe what interest is. Like, what is this thing where I have money and then I have more money? Well, what happens, you see, is you plant the money in the ground and then you sell your soul to the devil, and the devil ensures that more money is going to grow up from it. So you get the kind of witchcraft interpretation of something that feels like a very intuitive part of the financial system to somebody who's grown up in it. So those are things that really inspire me, and those are directions that I keep looking for as I'm trying to figure out next steps to take the sequence. I want to thank everybody for coming, and if you guys want to come up and continue the conversation afterwards, I'm totally happy with that. We have some books that I can sign also, and thanks so much for having me.